Hi again. So today we're going to talk about the Peter Singer article, All Animals Are Equal. This is a look, again, we're in value theory, but here we're looking at ethics specifically, and more specifically, animal ethics. So the question of what, if any, ethical obligations do human beings have towards non-human animals? Probably the main way that most of us interact with animals indirectly is through eating them and eating animal products. We also have pets, and see squirrels running around, and maybe you hang out in certain places where you see some wild animals. But for most of us in industrialized countries, we produce, kill, and consume a lot of animals and animal products. And that's going to be our focus today. That's sort of the main concern that Singer has, because the number of animals that are used for food far outweighs the number of animals that are used for other purposes, right? Like in the fashion industry or even in animal testing, that kind of stuff. So I think it's the case, right? Most people think that that it's morally permissible to eat meat, at least under certain conditions, right? Maybe that's sort of the common sense view. Singer thinks it's wrong, and he provides a philosophical argument to try and make his case that actions like that would be wrong. So again, I've mentioned earlier in the semester that philosophy is, or at least can be, practical, right? Practically useful. And here I think is a case of that, right? Where we sort of, many of us take something for granted, but there are reasons to question whether that's the case, whether it's permissible to kill and eat animals. A philosopher like Singer is not interested in just offering an opinion, right? Saying, hey, I think it's wrong, stop doing that. That would be very interesting, but he provides reasons for why he thinks it's wrong. Right? So instead of sort of condemning people or anything like that, he says, well, no, here are my reasons, hear me out, and if you think I'm wrong, then, well, show me where I go wrong in the argument, right? What premise is wrong, or where have I made a flaw in my logic? If you can't do that, then you should accept the conclusion. And in this case, you should recognize that animals are owed moral consideration. We should probably stop eating them. So I'll present his argument and try to get clear on why he thinks that, as he says, all animals are equal, right? So humans are animals too, right? So he starts off with this idea of what he calls speciesism. And this was supposed to be analogous to, it's defined as species-based discrimination, right? So treating organisms differently, or treating organisms in certain ways based solely on the species to which they belong. Typically, it's going to be in a negative way, right? Where we say, well, it's okay to kill and eat animals that aren't human because they aren't human. They're a different species. Most of us, I assume, agree that it's wrong to kill and eat humans, right? And often the reason given is that, well, they're other humans, right? You can't harm other humans like that, but the non-humans, it's okay. So Singer says, well, this is speciesism in the sense that it appeals just to the species membership, and he thinks it's a bad reason, right? So just as it would be wrong to discriminate on other morally irrelevant features, right, like race or gender or something like that, he thinks what species something belongs to is also morally irrelevant. It just doesn't matter. Now, you might find that implausible at first. You might say, well, you can't compare, say a cow to a human being. And Singer, of course, admits there's all sorts of differences between species. Among all sorts of species are very widespread, deep differences. But he thinks the mere fact that something is a different species by itself is a bad reason to treat it as less than equal to yourself. So to sort of see that, consider these cases. In the past, there were a bunch of other hominid species that were pretty similar to humans. They've all died off. So it's almost only Homo sapiens that are left, so our species. But at one point there was, you had Homo erectus, you had Neanderthals, you had other guys running around like the little hobbit humans. So they were pretty similar to us, but they were different species. They were not Homo sapiens. So imagine they were still around today, right? So you had Neanderthals. Would it be okay to go kill them, right? Hunt them for food and eat them? These would be pretty intelligent creatures, right? So they have language, they use tools, they're like us in a lot of ways, but they're a different species. Right? So I might say, well, it's not human, so of course it's okay for me to go and sort of, kill these families and, dine on their flesh. What's the problem? You probably see how, well, the mere fact that they're a different species doesn't really matter. It's not really relevant, right? You might say, so what? Yeah, technically they're a different species, right? They're, it's Homo erectus or whatever the Neanderthals were. I don't know the scientific name. But that doesn't matter, right? It's just a biological classification, right? Species membership is just not morally relevant any more than race or gender or something like that. So yeah, Neanderthals are different from us, but that doesn't make it okay, necessarily at least, to go and kill them. Take another example, right? So imagine that a species from a different planet, right? Aliens visit Earth, right? And they're this advanced society, culture, right? They have this great technology, and they decide they don't like us, and they say, we're just going to kill you guys, right? Maybe you're bad for the Earth or something. You're messing up this place, so we're just going to fix things, right? We're doing a good thing here. And you might say, wait, it's wrong to kill us, right? We wouldn't like that, right? We would think that, no, you have no right to kill us. We deserve to be treated as equal to you. And they might say, why? You're a different species, right? You're Homo sapiens. Why should we care? We probably wouldn't find that a convincing argument, right? We'd probably say, no, it doesn't matter that we're a different species. What matters is something else. And the question is, okay, well, what is it? We're going to get to that next. But you can see with these two examples, right? The aliens that want to kill us off, and the Neanderthals that maybe some of us would want to kill off, kind of indicates that maybe Singer has a point, and that the species which something is doesn't really matter in an ethical sense in and of itself, right? It's just a biological category. So this doesn't prove by any means that it's wrong to kill and eat animals, but it does suggest that if you want a good reason for doing so, simply saying they're a different species is probably not going to be a good reason, because that same reason then would apply in the case of the aliens or eating the other hominids, right? If you feel like, no, that would be wrong to do, that indicates that, well, the species probably doesn't really matter. So that leads to the next question. Okay, what is it that matters? What's sort of the correct criterion? If this isn't what species you are, then what's sort of the right, what's the criterion that determines whether something should be treated as sort of a member of the moral community? So I'm going to use the term moral consideration here. And the question is, what beings deserve moral consideration? So which ones deserve to be viewed as having things like rights, or that deserve to be treated as equal to us, or whose interests we have to take into account, that deserve our respect, things like that. And that's a good question. So Singer's suggestion is that the correct criterion is not what species you are, but rather sentience. So I'll explain what what sentience is. It means literally something like the capacity to have sensations or feelings. It's sometimes misused to refer to intelligence, but that would be actually sapience is the Latin for wisdom, something like that, intelligent. Sentience is broader. It refers to any being, any creature that has feelings, consciousness, awareness. So that probably includes certainly humans, but not just humans, right? It also includes many animal species. Seems like birds, mammals, maybe fish, but certainly birds and mammals would be pretty clear cases where it seems pretty obvious from their behavior that they can feel things. And for Singer, the important fact is that they can feel pleasure and pain. So in other words, they can have good experiences, pleasurable ones, and they can have bad experiences, painful ones. So their lives can go well or they can go badly, right? So a life full of pain and suffering is not a good life for whatever it is that's living that life, whether it's a human, whether it's a bird, whether it's a dolphin, right? Pain is pain, and it's by its very nature, it is bad, right? Feels bad for the person or animal who experiences that pain. Same thing for the pleasure, right? That's a good thing, right? You see here relation to hedonism, which we're going to come back to also. But Singer thinks, okay, sentience includes not just humans, but many animals. It probably doesn't include plants, right? It doesn't seem that, well, there's no evidence that I'm aware of, and it certainly doesn't seem like it's the case that plants have feelings, have consciousness. They're living things, right? But does a plant feel pain if you uproot it? In some sense, it might be bad for the plant, right? You might say, it's sort of its nature to grow and reproduce and do all that, and if you stop it, it's kind of bad, for the plant. Maybe that's true in some sense, but it doesn't feel pain, right? It's you might, how do I know that, right? I'm not a plant, but it sure doesn't seem like it based on their behavior, and also based on their physiology, right? So it seems that feeling pleasure and pain has something to do with having a nervous system, right? Nerve endings, a brain, that kind of stuff. Well, many animals have that, plants don't. Also, there are animal species that don't seem to have that stuff. So maybe clams or something don't feel pleasure and pain. So if that's the case, then Singer would say it's okay to eat clams. But the next question is, well, why should sentience be the criterion for moral consideration? So in other words, Singer believes that if a being is sentient, then we have to show some kind of respect for it, in the sense that we have to consider, or we ought to morally consider what's good for it, what's bad for it, before we decide what to do. Just as I have to think about how my actions affect other humans, right? I can't just do whatever I want because I might hurt people. Singer thinks, well, that extends to animals too, because they're sentient beings. I don't have to consider the interest of plants or of rocks or of animals that don't have sentience, because the criterion for whether something deserves moral consideration is this awareness, this capacity for sensations. But the question now is, why is that plausible? Why should we agree with Singer? So we said species membership is, according to him at least, not a good criterion for whether something deserves to be considered. Why choose sentience? Why not something else? Why not choose being alive or something like that? And it's because Singer thinks that sentience links up in an important way with having interests. So an interest, you've heard the phrase something is in your best interest or something is contrary to your interests. That basically means that something's good or bad for you. So what's in my interest is good for me, it's beneficial. What's against my interest is bad for me, right? It's harmful. So it's a question, well, where do we draw the line between creatures that can have things be good or bad for them, things that have interests, and things that don't have interests and for whom things are not good or bad? And he thinks, well, sentience offers a very plausible way to do that. So remember, pain is pain. It feels bad. That's its nature. So anything that feels it is going to be experiencing something that's against its interest. And on the flip side, if something feels pleasure, on Singer's view, it's experiencing something that is in line with its interests, something that's good for it, beneficial. So Singer thinks it's plausible to say, well, trying to extend moral consideration beyond sentient creatures, so to say that I have a duty to a plant, he doesn't think that really makes sense because things can't be good or bad for that plant. It doesn't have any experience of good or bad because it doesn't have the capacity. It doesn't have a sentient awareness, sentience or awareness. So things aren't bad for it, things aren't good for it. The plant just has no experiences. It just is. It's a living thing, but it's not aware of what's going on. Same with a rock, right? Inanimate objects. We don't have to show any kind of moral respect to those things. It doesn't matter how I treat a table, right? I can't do anything wrong to the table because it's not a sentient being, and so it doesn't feel anything. And I can cut it in half. It might be a bad idea because I'm wrecking my furniture, but if there's any victim there, it's the owner, right, of the table. It's not the table itself. So Singer thinks, all right, you can't extend, or you shouldn't extend moral consideration beyond beings that are sentient, but you also shouldn't deny it to creatures that are sentient, because that's just arbitrary, right? If I say that the pain and the pleasure of humans matter, but not of, say, chimpanzees, well, the question is why? That seems pretty arbitrary. If you say, well, it's because it's the human, right? It's the fact that a human has pleasure and pain, that's what makes it special. Now we're back to the speciesism. Well, I think that species matters. It's just a biological category, right? So what? It seems more consistent, right, and principled to say, no, pain by its very nature is bad. Pleasure by its very nature is good. So anything that can experience those things can experience good or bad things. And that includes many animals, right? At least based on their behavior, it seems like they can feel pain and pleasure. And their physiology suggests that they should be able to also. So you can see then where this is going. Singer says, all right, because it's sentience that matters, because of its being tied to having an interest, we have a moral obligation to consider the interests of all sentient beings, human and non-human, and that includes animals. So it's not hard to see why he would be against killing and eating animals, because those are sentient creatures. They suffer a lot in typical conditions of being raised, and then of course their lives are ended. It does result in some good stuff, I guess, from his view, that human beings get to eat the food and it tastes good. They like that, so that's pleasurable. But it, in Singer's judgment, does not justify the massive pain, right? That's caused in the process of raising the animals. And this is something, this gets into how animals are produced nowadays. So the reason that that meat is so cheap in the modern day, and a lot of people can eat a lot of it, right, which isn't necessarily healthy, but is now economically available, is because that meat is mass produced, right? So you think of farms, right? And a lot of people think of, animals running around, right, on the family farm. You got a few cows, they hang out and they have a decent life, and then, yeah, of course they're killed, but you do it humanely maybe, and that's fine. But the reality is that most of us get our meat and animal products from sources that are a lot uglier than that, right? So so-called factory farms, right, where the reason that the product is so cheap is because you really cram a lot of them, right, mass produce them into conditions in which there's not going to be much money or attention spent on giving them a good life for the months or years that they're alive. Um, so one uh, example is comes from Singer himself. So in a book that he wrote, you read what's a chapter from this a classic book and he came out with in the 70s called Animal Liberation. But more recently, he wrote a book called The Ethics of What We Eat. And to research that book, he actually got a job for a while as an artificial turkey inseminator at a turkey farm. And the idea was he wanted to research for the book, right? You can only learn so much by reading. He wanted to go actually see and experience firsthand what it was like for the animals and for the workers. And I think the plan was to work there like a week or something. And the job of artificial turkey inseminator is it's not a great job. I think it's not inseminating artificial turkeys, but they're real turkeys. But they've been bred to have such large breasts that they can't reproduce normally, right? Because it just doesn't, they can't fit there. So it's somebody's job to go around in some kind of device, I assume, and do this artificially so that you make more turkeys, so that you can raise more of them and sell them and sell the meat, make good profit. He only lasted, I think, 2 days because the conditions were so brutal, right? That he couldn't finish the job. And there is a lot of turnover in these jobs. The workers aren't treated well, of course. But it's a question, right? In a condition like this, the animals are really crowded together. They're often going to be very unhappy. So, for example, chickens, they get so stressed out being crowded into these sheds, right, where you have hundreds or thousands of the guys. They get so stressed out about that they start pecking each other, which causes damage to the product. So a common practice is to debeak them. So as chicks, you burn off the sharp edge of their beak with a hot iron, and that's pretty painful for them. But it's done to keep them from pecking each other to death. They're still stressed out, but it's a lot cheaper to remove their beaks than it is to give them more space. If they did that, the second one, then they'd have to raise the price of the chicken, and consumers would probably buy from a competitor then that has the cheaper chicken. So it's a question in conditions like this. Once you start looking, and there are videos you can find online. So there is a documentary called Meet Your Meat, which is a pretty good title. That if you're interested, take a look at this. Other reputable documentaries and sources that can show with video, and it's pretty gruesome in many cases, but can show what the conditions are like inside many of these operations. So I've heard it said before that if the public in general knew, right, if they could sort of see directly what was happening, that the industry would collapse overnight because people would be so disgusted. I don't know if that's true, but it is hard to watch some of this stuff. So I don't show it in class, but if you're interested, I invite you to take a look. And if you want recommendations, you can send me an email, point towards something credible, right? Not something fake or made up. So anyway, I think it's pretty hard to deny with Singer that the animals in these operations suffer a lot. There's a lot of pain on top of the death. The question is, does that matter in a moral sense? Should we humans care? Do we have an obligation to stop engaging in those practices? And for example, to stop buying the products that come from operations like that. I think the common view is, well, it's okay to eat animals. There are different species. But as we've seen, Singer raises some problems for that idea. Right? So he gives an argument and the argument is basically something like the following, right? So it's going to say that all sentient entities deserve moral consideration. Non-human animals, or most of them at least, or many of them, non-human animals are sentient creatures. Therefore, non-human animals deserve moral consideration. So sort of looking at those two premises, the second one, right, that many non-human animals are sentient. Hard to deny that one. That, I guess you could try, but it seems pretty clear that animals do feel pleasure and pain, so that one's hard to deny. So probably if you want to critique the argument, you'd look at premise one, and you'd challenge Singer's claim that all sentient entities deserve moral consideration, should have their interests taken into account. Right? Remember, Singer does have a reason for thinking that premise one is true, and that is, well, sentience is linked up to having an interest in this this essential way, right? Because anything that's sentient can feel good or bad things, pleasure, pain. And well, pleasure is good for the creature that feels it, bad, and pain is bad for the creature that feels that. So he thinks it would just be arbitrary to say only some sentient creatures matter, like humans, for example, right? Why draw the line there? It seems like, well, pleasure is good and pain is bad just by its nature. So anything that feels it should deserve moral consideration for the same reason that we give it to humans, right? It would be wrong, Singer argues, to mistreat a human being who, say, has, through a brain injury or something, lost their intelligence, right? So say they have the same intelligence of a dog or something like that. Nobody thinks it'd be justified, right, to treat that person however you want, right? We think, no, we still have a duty to treat that person well. Why? Singer says, well, it's because they're still sentient, right? If you mistreat them, it'll hurt, and it's wrong. It's wrong to hurt people. But it would be, again, arbitrary to draw the line at saying it's only bad to hurt people, it's okay to hurt animals. Singer thinks it's much more consistent and plausible to say it's just wrong to hurt stuff, right? So that's his argument, right? And again, what's kind of pesky about, well, one thing about philosophers is Singer's not just like a crazy guy in the subway who's yelling at you, telling you to stop eating meat, right? That's easy to kind of ignore and, just say, okay, whatever, moving on here. He's not a fanatic. He has arguments, right? He gives reasons. He's very rational about it. Now, he might be wrong. Maybe he made a mistake somewhere in the argument. But if we take if we take rationality and ethics seriously, then it seems like we have an obligation to seriously consider this. Maybe he's right. And if he is right, then most of us should probably change our behavior in pretty drastic ways. Singer's view is that we should stop eating animals and animal products altogether, right? That you can, for most humans, under most conditions, it's possible to have a vegan diet that's perfectly healthy. And that involves no pain to animals. Well, depending on how you source the stuff. So maybe there's still some harm to animals, but it's going to be much less through habitat loss or something. But it's going to be much less than that you see from eating animal products or animals themselves, the meat. So he thinks, well, maybe that bar is too high. People find it hard to do that. Well, at least become a vegetarian then, is his view, right? So you still have some animal products, right, like dairy and so on. Yeah, the cows aren't treated that well, but it's better than meat. If you can't do that, say, well, okay, at least stop eating meat from factory farms, right? So be willing to pay more for meat that comes from so-called ethical or humane farms that treat their animals humanely, and then end up killing them, right? And butchering the animals. But that would be better on Singer's view. He doesn't like it, but better than factory farming because there's going to be much less suffering for the animals while they're alive than in the factory farm situation. So if if you think that's unrealistic, remember ethics is about specifying what we should do, right? So if you say, well, the world's never going to go along with that, Singer, people are going to keep eating meat, although many people have read his work and been convinced to change, but it might not change the world. And Singer might respond by saying, well, I never predicted that it would. I just said that it should, right? Making an ethical argument, you're saying what's right and trying to give reasons for why people should do this or that. If people don't play along, right, then that's not the fault of the person making the argument. That's the fault of the people who choose not to be ethical, right? So I mention that because that's something to keep in mind. Sometimes people make the mistake when it comes to philosophical ethics of criticizing arguments because they're hard to live up to the conclusions. But that doesn't really seem like a criticism of the argument, right? If we say, oh, we could never do that, well, that says something about us, but that doesn't mean that it isn't the right thing to try and live up to that. Okay, so the main thing here is to make sure you understand Singer's argument for why non-human animals deserve moral consideration. Understand what he means by speciesism, what he means by sentience, and what it means to have an interest. Are going to be the most important main points. Okay, see you next time.